A common mantra, I suppose, amongst coaches is to make practice harder than a game. And this is actually fairly easy to do because hard is a fairly vague term. And so you can make a practice harder simply by making it much longer than a game. So the average player in a high school game is going to play maybe 25 to 28 minutes if he's one of the better players, maybe 16 to 20 minutes if he is a starter, something in there. Your best player may play the whole 32 minutes. So if you run a practice of 2.5, 3 hours, that's going to be much harder than just the game. And I've talked to coaches recently who are running 2.5, 3 hour practices in the preseason. And that is harder than the game because the length of time, the volume of running, depending on how the practice is structured, is more than what you're going to get during a game. But what coaches tend to mean, and some coaches actually state, is they want the intensity to be higher than in a game. This is more problematic. Again, part of the problem is if you're practicing for 2 hours, it's almost impossible to have the same type of intensity over that 2 hours that you're going to have during a game, especially when you're trying to have an overly efficient practice where there's no standing around and no dead time, because we know in a game there is dead time, and you do stand around, and there's quarters, and there's halftime, and there are timeouts, and there's breaks naturally built into the game that allow players to recover quickly and then put in more effort after that break. So if the goal in the practice is to have a perfectly efficient practice where we don't have any players standing around and we don't waste any time with any unnecessary breaks, it's unrealistic to expect the same intensity, especially over a 2 hour practice, that we would put in 32 minutes of game time. And not to mention even the extra effect that the game has playing a different opponent, the social effects of having fans there. All of these work to increase the intensity of a game that aren't possible to replicate during practice. So it is very difficult to replicate that intensity during practice, and so the goal is to practice, to make practice as intense as possible, but it's generally still going to be slightly less intense than a game, even in the best situations. Now, if you really want to make, let's say, the running more intense than the running in a game, you can do that because we know that in the course of those 32 minutes, we're probably not going to have too many maximum speed sprints. The length of the court makes it difficult, not just because it's going to take probably 30 to 40 meters to reach top speed anyway, and a basketball court's only roughly 30 meters, but also because most high school gyms, especially, there's not much distance between the end of the court and the wall. So not only do you not have more than 30 yards or 30 meters to run, but that distance is actually cut even shorter because you have to slow down so that you don't run into the wall at full speed. But if you want to increase the intensity of the running, let's say, you can go out on a track and run 40, 50 meter sprints, and now it would be possible to have more intense sprinting than you would have in a game. But that would require more rest periods than you have in a game. So if I want a higher velocity sprint or a more intense sprint, I can give more rest. So let's say during a game, your timeouts average 30 seconds to a minute. But if I want a full speed, 50 meter, 60 meter sprint, I might give, a 3-5 minute recovery so that I can maintain that intensity. So these are, the basics of training planning. The more volume you have, the intensities tend to be lower. The lower the volume, the higher the intensities. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to increase both volume and intensity at the same time. So I saw a Twitter post recently that talked about how during the course of a season the coach would decrease the volume of practice, but the intensity would remain the same. And so it talked about, beginning the season, 2.5 hour practices, kind of right as the season's starting, 2 hour practices, and then as we're getting to playoffs, only about a 45-minute practice. But if the intensity is remaining the same, I'd argue that we're probably not practicing intense enough in those 45-minute practices, because the intensity, while coaches like to think or believe that over that 2.5 hours, it's full intensity, it really isn't. And it's really not possible to have maximum intensity over a 2.5 hour period. Now, it could be a maximum intensity for that volume of practice. And it could be possible if you have a lot of break time during those 2.5 hours that you could structure very intense segments of practice, take some rest time, have another very intense segment of practice, at or approaching game intensity, take another break, similar to halftime with, halftime's 10 to 15-minute break in the middle of a game. You could replicate that in a 2.5 hour practice and practice hard for 20 to 30 minutes, take a 15-minute break and practice hard. But I've never seen, a coach who does that on a regular basis. Typically, we have a 2.5 hour practice. We want to get 2.5 hours of work as efficiently as possible, as few breaks as possible. And so consequently, our intensity is going to be submaximal. Whereas when we go 45 minutes, the intensity actually should be higher at the end of the season in a 45-minute practice than it is at the beginning of the season in a 2.5 hour practice. And that's because the volume of training is much less. Again, it depends on how the exact practice structure works and how many breaks and how long the breaks and et cetera, et cetera. But again, if you're aiming for a 2.5 hour efficient practice where there's no standing around and minimum breaks, and a 45-minute practice that essentially does the same thing, the 45-minute practice should be more intense because the volume is lower. And that's how kind of the spectrum works in terms of measuring volume and intensity. The greater the volume, the less the intensity. The greater the intensity, the less the volume. And so as a coach, you need to balance what's more important. Is it more important to have lots of repetitions early in the season? Probably. But that's probably going to reduce some of the intensity. And then at the end of the season, is it more important to get those repetitions, or is it more important to be practicing at a higher level of intensity with a lower volume so we can probably reduce some of the residual fatigue that the volume creates? Yeah, it's probably better to have fresher players and to have some more high-speed repetitions, but a lot fewer repetitions so that we're staying at game intensity between games, but we don't spend a lot of time on any extra activities and we stay fresh for the next game. That would be how I would approach things, acknowledging that the intensity is going to be a little bit less than game intensity at the beginning of the season as practice is longer. And then towards the end of the season, we want to reduce the volume so that we can increase the intensity, try to approximate the game intensity when we're in the playoff situations, and also to reduce the volume so that we can reduce the fatigue in between games.